I want to also move on to the Donald Trump's visit to the United Kingdom. And, you know, what Sadiq Khan had to say, and Boris Johnson saying, you know, he's not fit to be president. Of course, that was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And, you know, let's just dig into this a little bit. Theresa May's pending departure, you know, who's going to be prime minister, what's going on with the EU elections, with our resident expert on all things European, Victoria Jones. She's the executive director of the DC Radio Company, LLC. And her Twitter handle is Victoria Jones DC. And Victoria, welcome back.
I'm not wearing a hat.
Oh, my. What does that mean?
I know. Well, I just feel underdressed today, considering how magnificent the hats are.
Oh, I see.
You know, and
yes.
Yes.
Okay. So you should be wearing a hat because we're talking. Okay, I get it. I'm curious. You know, first of all, Donald Trump, Buckingham Palace invited Barack Obama to sleep in the palace. They apparently have something like 30, 40, 50 guest rooms. But they told Donald Trump that they're undergoing a substantial renovation. What's going on here?
Well, it depends. I'm sure there are renovations going on. The question is, how extensive are the renovations? And nobody is really saying this. Nobody is saying, well, you know, they're so extensive that he can't stay there. Nobody's saying they're so minimal that it's a way of not allowing him to stay there. So everybody is being very circumspect and saying there are renovations, and so he has to stay at Winfield House. So everybody is being incredibly polite about this. But there is an undercurrent there about it, in the same way that heads of state are usually welcomed by the Queen at Horse Guards parade. Occasionally, they're welcomed on the lawn of the palace, but it's a more downbeat welcome, to be welcomed sort of in the back garden, you know, in the backyard.
Interesting. So are these insults to Trump, or are these?
No.
Is there any meaning to this?
Sometimes there are subtle meanings. He is getting a state banquet tonight, and it is all the trappings, the place settings between the knives, forks, spoons, side plates, and the chairs are measured by a ruler. The Queen will inspect everything. So he is getting absolutely everything the way it should be done. But some things are now, it could have been security that he was welcomed in the palace rather than Horse Guards parade. It is notable that Barack Obama went to his welcome by the Queen in a motorcade where he was cheered. President Trump went by helicopter, and he will go from the American ambassador's residence to the palace again tonight by helicopter. It's a terribly short distance, but they are worried about protests.
Wow. Is the Trump baby blimp flying?
I don't know if it's flying yet, but it is expected to fly tomorrow. Yeah. That's the day that he's having meetings with Prime Minister Theresa May. And tomorrow, Tuesday, is the more political day. Today is the pomp and circumstance day.
If Brexit happens, if a hard Brexit happens, the UK is going to have a real challenge in terms of international trade, and I would think, could really use the United States as a bilateral trade partner. Do you think that that is part of why Donald Trump was allowed to invite himself to this? My understanding is that he's the one who asked them to invite him over. And if that's the case, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, do you think that that might have something to do with it?
Yes, I do, absolutely. But the U.S. ambassador to the UK has caused great alarm and consternation among many, including many conservative members of Parliament, by a television interview that he gave in the last 24 hours, in which he was talking about possible trade deals with America, and that everything would be on the table, including chlorinated chicken in from the United States, which is something that is just horrendous. And he was saying, well, you know, they could choose not to buy it, And then and he was asked, well, what about the National Health Service? Was that? And he was saying, yes, even the National Health Service. And that's, at that point, conservative members of Parliament started to go ballistic.
Because wait a minute, because we eat food here in the United States that would be illegal in the UK because it's not healthy or it's dangerous, right, like chlorinated chicken, which sounds weird, but it's probably, wow. So
yes, but the National Health Service, the idea that the United States might insist on bringing in private firms, and that a conservative prime minister such as Boris Johnson might be open to the idea of a further privatized National Health Service with American firms involved, was horrifying to many in Britain.
So do you think that, I mean, you know, Trump, it seems that from his point of view, Donald Trump thinks that showing up in the UK and promoting the candidacy of Boris Johnson is going to help Boris Johnson become the next prime minister. Might it work the exact opposite way?
It could work the opposite way. The thing is that many conservative MPs are looking at who is most likely in a possible general election, which could happen anytime soon, really, right, to defeat Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn most fears running against Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn being the leader of the Labour Party. He right, fears Boris Johnson because Boris Johnson is a very good campaigner. He is considered somebody who's not bothered whether he says things that are accurate or not.
Boris Johnson.
He's very charismatic, Boris Johnson.
So yes, he's kind of the UK's version of Trump.
In some ways, but he also, you know, he went to, I think it was Oxford. He's very bright. He's clever and right, clever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think Trump is clever. I don't think he's particularly bright, but you know, it's so. Okay. So we've talked about that and how you think that's probably going to shake out. How the European Parliament elections just happened, what, a week or so ago? And while everybody was all agog about the rise of the right-wing parties, I think the really big news was that the left-wing parties really had a much more significant victory, broadly speaking, than the right-wing parties, you know, with the exception of the delegations from some of the more right-wing countries. Where does all this go?
I think it's interesting, very interesting, because the mainstream parties didn't do well, but parties on sort of either end of the spectrum did well. I mean, I think it speaks to a real disaffection with mainstream politics. I don't know where I think it shows the opening of the system. And I think that's something that mainstream politicians need to look out for, and that they're not looking out for because they just can't believe that the system that has worked so well for so long could possibly really be under threat, even though they see it all the time. I want to mention one other thing that is going to come up in talks with Theresa May,
okay,
and that is national security. And that is Britain's, it's not a done deal yet, but Huawei, and Britain is going to bring Huawei in to do 5G. And Theresa May cast the deciding vote in her cabinet, and many in her cabinet wildly resist the idea because they think China's going to spy on them, which I think is. And Trump is saying, well, we will probably or may not share intelligence with you anymore if you bring Huawei in, which is a huge development as Britain is part of the Five Eyes nations which share intelligence. This is a major, major development.
Well, and then the flip side of that is that Donald Trump has allowed, by executive order, allowed the highly political Attorney General, Bill Barr, the guy who engineered the cover-up of the Iran-Contra scandal back in 1992 when he was Attorney General. He has allowed him to go to our intelligence agencies and pull out any information he wants and make it public or distribute it in other ways. And, you know, there's considerable concern that the Five Eyes countries who basically openly share intelligence with the United States, and you're going to have to refresh my memory as who those countries are. I know it's the UK, Australia, but I don't recall who the other three are.
Canada and New Zealand.
Canada and New Zealand, thank you. This is kind of the these are all the English-speaking countries, you know, that that the Five Eyes countries are pretty freaked out that a political agent is going to be able to burrow into what literally would be, you know, who are the spies, where are they, what are they saying? I mean, you know, is that, you know, there's been a lot of publicity here about the repercussions of that. How about in the UK? How about in Europe?
There's a lot of concern about that overseas. And I gather overseas in the intelligence agencies, and also I gather in the intelligence agencies here that sources and methods that active agents could be put at risk by this, and that also that agents or sources out in the field are just going to clam up and not say anything.